Well, chapter 2 from Alaska's Reading Playbook deals with phonics. So let's get into some phonic considerations in secondary literacy. General chapter overview. After you've read the chapter, I'm not going to go into a lot of details about it. You can go back through the chapter to see some specific examples of these, right? But the idea of phonics is that it is the sounds of language. And phononyms, right, that we already talked about, are the sounds that we hear, where phonics is being able to recognize those sounds in what we read, and seeing those letter combinations and knowing what sound that they make. So it's the idea of reading sounds, not letters. There are 79 phonographs, bigger sounds that our language is made out of. That includes the prefixes, suffixes, the Greek and Latin roots, understanding those, knowing those, understanding that our words are comprised of syllables, which are those sound units, right? And there are 6 types of syllables. That there's a common syllable division. There's a common way that syllables are set up in sentence or in words, and how those combinations exist in the patterns, and the morphology, which is finding the, looking at the smallest meaning of words within. So it's this actually pretty complicated, complex thing when you really get into it, thinking about Greek and Latin roots, prefixes and suffixes, the different types of syllables and how they're made, the sounds of letters, and the sounds of letters combined to make phonemes. I mean, it gets really complex when you start thinking about all of the things. Well, what happens here is when we hit the secondary level, we have students, one, that still need phonics. Even if they are at grade level reading, there's still times that they need phonics, and I'll give you examples of that in a little bit. But 2, we have students that have missed some of these really complex bases of information that they need to be able to read, and it's hard to learn them later. It just is. When you have memorized the prefixes and suffixes and the Greek and Latin roots, and you just kind of know what something means when you look at it, you don't think about it. We just habitually do it, right? You don't know when you learned it. These are some of those really early skills we learn reading, and I don't remember learning them. I just know that I know them. But when we have students that are missing those things, we have to look at them. We have to tackle that with students, because they will struggle in all areas in school if they are missing phonics instruction, and that's the main problem that they have in their reading literacy. Okay, so again, we're going to look at this idea of phonics under our umbrella of literacy, the Bloom's taxonomy, the Scarborough rope, and because we are talking about secondary learners, we are going to keep that under the umbrella of the adolescent brain. We cannot separate anything that we do and teach adolescents from how their brains are functioning, or we will not be successful. They just won't retain the information if we don't consider those ideas. Okay, so looking back at the Scarborough reading rope, right? When we're talking about phonics, we are really talking about decoding and sight word recognition. As I said, there's a lot of complexities that go into this. This is 2 of the 3 bottom strands here is just this idea of phonics, right? So students need to be able to decode sight words, sight sounds, sight symbols, right? It's not just letters, even, symbols. If they see something in science that says pH, what does that mean? What does LB mean? Oh, that's pounds, right? These are symbols that are also decoding. So it's this idea of decoding, being able to see a sound or a word, any sort of symbol, and understanding what it means. Phonics is complex and keeps getting more complex, as I said, as their vocabulary increases on this top part of the Scarborough rope. The breadth of their vocabulary increases. We get into more complex, content-specific terms. Then we still need to look at phonics, and because those content-specific terms are made up of sounds that they already recognize, and they need to be able to recognize the sounds that they know and be able to combine them together and figure out the meaning and the sound of the new word. So these are things I've already said before, so I'm not going to spend as much time, but remember that when you're dealing with phonics with secondary literacy, learners already have vocabulary and background knowledge. Regardless of how much phonics is missing, they already still have information that they've learned. They've adapted. They've figured out how to, accommodate to themselves so that they can still be fairly successful in school in this avenue or that avenue, even if their phonics skills are severely lacking. So keep in mind that just because they're missing phonics doesn't mean they're not bright in a lot of other ways. They can still use figurative language. These are adolescents. They talk sarcastically. They say jokes. They understand metaphors and similes and alliteration. They understand these things even if they can't decode off the page, right? And they might still have, some sight word recognition. If they have memorized sight words, any of them, they might not understand the different phonemes that are making them up, but if they see it and they know what it means, cool. So just because a child is, again, struggling with their phonics in the secondary level doesn't mean they don't have other words that they can read very well. Okay, so same concept here with the Bloom's taxonomy. When we are missing decoding skills, that doesn't mean that they can't apply information. And that might even be one of the ways that they've been able to adapt when they're unable to decode the words on the page. They might even have gotten better at some of these higher level thinking skills to try to figure out what to do in order to problem solve. So they might not be able to decode what they're reading, but they see what other people are doing around them and they apply that to what they're supposed to be doing, even if they weren't able to read the directions, right? They might be able to sort of guess what you mean when you are reading off the board and you're reading really quickly. They might be able to guess and analyze and figure out what you're talking about, even if they don't understand the words on the board, right? So keeping that in mind, that again, just because a child is missing basic decoding skills doesn't mean that they don't have these other higher level thinking skills that they've been able to develop over time. Okay, so thinking about the adolescent brain, some considerations that we need to keep in mind when you're specifically trying to teach phonics to students. I have seen many a times that students have been sort of pulled away from their peers and put on sort of phonics instruction programs online and just working on phonics. And that tends to not benefit the adolescent as much as it could, because when they know that they're supposed to know phonics. They know that. They are secondary learners. They know that they're supposed to know how to read these basic words and decode them. That's not new information to them, but they don't know how to. And so just putting them onto phonics programs, one, automatically leads to the embarrassment. They are 100% peer driven. That is that important thing. That social identity is so important. So when they're pulled apart, when they're put into specific phonics type programs, they know, their peers know, and that embarrassment can make them want to not do the program or just force their way through it and get it done as quickly as possible so they can get out of the program. That doesn't mean that they necessarily were successful in actually retaining information. Also, putting them on a program of phonics, I think that would be boring personally. I would be bored. They are so driven by that dopamine seeking. They need to be entertained. They need to be having fun. So integrate phonics into other curriculum, into other things that they do. Support the students that need additional support with phonics, but also recognize that adolescents, even if they've learned early decoding skills, they still might need support with phonics, with new complex vocabulary, right? And remember that as adolescents, they can decode information when it's information that gives them, I don't know, maybe some dopamine fixes, social media. They know what LOL is and they know what SMH is. You might not. Look it up if you don't. I'm sure you all know what LOLs means. But this idea of seeing those symbols and knowing what they mean, that's decoding. That's phonics. They have that. Some, right? They're just missing some of those basic phonics skills, those basic sound recognition skills, those suffixes, those prefixes, those Latin, Greek words. But they can decode. So we need to remember that they do have those higher level thinking abilities, and they've adapted really well to be able to somehow succeed, to continue moving forward in school, even missing some of these basic skills. So the further that they get from that early decoding information that we learned at an early age in elementary school, they're going to be more skeptical of it because they haven't needed it up to this point. And adolescents very skeptical, right? So they're going to be like, why do I need this? Why do I already know this? I've seen this before, you know? So retaining the information isn't as important to them if they've seen it before. They've done it before. It's not going to be the first time that they've ever been talked about prefixes and suffixes and syllables with them if you're trying to do this with a secondary learner that needs some reading intervention, right? So they're going to get irritated. They're going to get really irritated if it's a skill that they think is below them and too basic. They might really need that skill, but if they feel like it's below them, they're not going to pay attention. So what do we do, right? So first of all, try to integrate phonics instruction into other curriculum, into things that you're already doing in the classroom. Try not to isolate students and pinpoint or demonstrate to other people that they are struggling with decoding and phonics skills, right? So I broke this up here into language arts, drama, and the other areas just as kind of before. In language arts and drama, you can use mentor sentences to mimic syllables. Look at a sentence that's written correctly. Notice how many syllables are in it. And be able to use the same amount of syllables in a new sentence, right? Writing poetry like haikus that recognize syllables, any type of poetry that requires a certain number of syllables on the page, great phonics instruction, fabulous. And that can be modified to the child's level into the complexity of the words that they use in haiku, right? Analyzing poetry that has meter, sonnets, iambic pentameter, these things have these sound units, stressed and unstressed syllables. These are all things that help teach phonic instruction. Swap prefixes and suffixes to change the meaning. If you add ed to the end of the word, what does that do? If you add ing to the end of the word, how does that change the type of word that we're using, right? Have students read their own writing, aloud to themselves, not necessarily in front of other people, embarrassing, remember, but to themselves. Have them listen to what they wrote. And does that sound right? What do they need to change to make those words sound correctly? Have students look for sight words within larger words. If they don't understand a larger word, what word within that word do you recognize, right? Alliterations and assonance in poetry. Again, we're doing phonics instruction. Lots of poetry has phonics instruction in it. Great way to integrate it. Social studies, science, math, arts, PE, yes, even PE. All students still need some phonics instruction. When you get into complex, content-specific terms in social studies, science, math, arts, those are new vocabulary words that have common suffixes that they might have seen before, common prefixes. So even our more advanced readers, or readers who are already at grade level, they still need some phonics instruction. So have them actually learn to say those more complex words correctly. Have them break them down into syllables and look for those common prefixes and suffixes, right? If students are missing decoding skills, this is the most important thing that all teachers need to know across content level and the secondary level. If students are missing decoding skills, they will struggle in all of their classes. Equations in math and chemistry require decoding. Worksheets, directions on the board, reading textbooks all require decoding, right? So even in PE, if there are directions on a board for what workouts they're supposed to do, and you read them to them one time quickly, and they didn't memorize it, and then they're trying to read it later, and they can't decode, they might struggle, they might act out. Just recognize that phonics, if there is missing phonics information in a student, they will struggle everywhere. So really take the time to differentiate instruction, Read the syllables and words. Make sure that students understand. Check for understanding.